This is a story of displacement, delusion, desperate overreaching, and possibly indictable behavior. I think you'll like it. It begins, as a lot of New York stories do, with an apartment. A $600 one-bedroom on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, rent-controlled. Now this was 13 years ago, but $600 was still a deal. The apartment was on a sketchy block between Avenues C and D, or what the locals called Avenues Coke and Dope. But I wasn't intimidated by that. I'd been living in New York for years. I'd been around. And besides, downtown was changing, gentrifying like crazy. It was only a matter of time before it crept east to Avenue C. So when the super of the building where I was living in an apartment the size of a storage locker told me about the new place, I felt like my ship had come in. Hector, the super, I'd been good to him, tipping him generously for doing what was in effect his job. And this was my payoff. It was the same landlord, a slippery character who variously insisted the rent checks be made out to the XYZ Corporation, the 123 Company, and New York Cardboard and Foam. But I wasn't asking questions. My first night there, I had a few celebratory beers and passed out happily in my spacious new pad. And then around 2 in the morning, I was woken up by what sounded like shouting and laughter in the hallway. So I went out to investigate. And from the landing on the second floor where my apartment was, I could see 3 men in the foyer. A big guy in track pants and a muscle tee, and 2 skinny creatures of the night, conducting a transaction. Now, I was cool. I'd been around. I didn't care about a little drug dealing. I just wanted to sleep. So I called down to them in a casual tone, and I said, "Hey, fellas." And they looked up at me like, "Who the fuck is this guy?" And I said, "Hey, listen, you guys think you could do me a favor? The noise seems to really travel in this building. You think you guys could keep it down?" They looked at one another, and then the big guy in the track pants looked up at me with a big smile, and he said, "No problem, bro. We'll keep it down." And I said, "Thank you. That's great." And I turned around and headed back to my apartment, feeling pretty good about the encounter. You know, we understand one another. You've got your thing to do. I've got my thing to do. We're cool. Peaceful coexistence. Well, I went back to bed, and I fell asleep about as soon as my head hit the pillow. And then about 2 hours later, I was woken up again by more shouting and laughter in the hall. And I thought about going outside and saying something, but by then I was so tired from the move, and I didn't want to deal with the hassle of it. So I just pulled the pillow tightly over my ears, and I fell fitfully back to sleep. Well, that scene played out numerous times over the next 3 to 4 weeks. And usually I didn't say anything as the noise in the hall sort of kicked up. But every once in a while it would get so loud, I felt compelled to go out and say something. And each time I did, the big guy in track pants, the dealer, would say, "No problem, bro." And I would turn around and go back to bed. And within an hour or two, the noise would kick up again. Until one night, when I went out to complain as usual. And this time, the dealer didn't say anything, just looked up at me, his smile noticeably thinner than usual. And I didn't think much about it, went back to bed. Well, the next day I got up late, tired, and went out for Chinese food. And as I left the building, I passed between the dealer and his girlfriend, who were standing at the entrance to the front door like sentinels. And if you think he was scary looking, let me tell you. And they were standing there like this, and I had to pass between them. And as I did, they sort of giggled to one another behind my back. And when I got back with the Chinese food, they were still standing there, and I had to squeeze past the girlfriend to get in the front door. And as I did, she leaned over and whispered something that sounded like, "You're dead." I just hesitated for the slightest moment and then moved numbly past her and up the stairs, wondering how this had become a scene in my life. When I got upstairs, I put my key in the lock, or tried to. It turned out someone had crazy glued it. Now I was really freaked, because I assumed the crazy glue had something to do with what the girlfriend had whispered to me. If I'd even heard her right, I couldn't be sure. Maybe the crazy glue was just kids in the building messing with the new guy. Because when I moved in, there were these little kids in the building who took to following me up and down the stairs, laughing behind my back and mumbling, "Pendejo, pendejo." Pendejo, dumbass, creep. Literally, pubic hair. So I thought, maybe the crazy glue was just the charming little urchins messing with the pendejo. Or maybe my life really was in danger. The truth was, I was so sleep deprived and now rattled by the business at the front door, I couldn't be sure of anything. Well, at that point, I decided I had to get a locksmith to get me back into the apartment. And at that point, I decided to just lay low for a while, not make any complaints about the noise, and see how things went. The trouble was, there were a lot of other things going on at the same time, and I was starting to go a little nuts. A construction crew broke ground on the empty lot next door, so that even my waking hours were now punctuated by the sound of jackhammers and pile driving that made the entire building wobble. I took to cranking my air conditioner day and night to try and drown out the noise, which didn't work at all. Only meant that I was getting up sleep deprived and with a chip. In fact, I felt I was becoming seriously ill. This was the summer of West Nile, and after noticing the mosquitoes buzzing over the garbage in the air shaft outside my kitchen window, I was convinced I could feel the tiny viral organisms burrowing into my brain tissue. So one night when the noise in the hall kicked up again at 3 a.m., I snapped. And I marched out, half-dressed, crazed from lack of sleep, possibly infected with West Nile. And I called down to the foyer in a voice that came to me from some TV cop show. And I said, "Listen, fellas, this isn't going to fly anymore. Get it? Business is closed." And they looked up at me, bemused. Like they couldn't decide whether to bust out laughing or run up the stairs and kick my ass. But my lizard brain had kicked in, and time slowed down as if I were in the middle of a car wreck. And I said, "And if you're thinking of doing something stupid, I wouldn't recommend it." And then I whipped around and marched back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me. And that night, I slept better than I had in weeks. I didn't know if it was because they had listened to me and kept the noise down, or because I was so dog-tired I slept through it. But I noticed over the next few days that the people in the building were cutting me a wider berth than usual in the hall. Even the little kids were keeping their distance. The dealer and his girlfriend were avoiding eye contact. I figured it had to do with me standing my ground. I had earned some grudging respect. And then one afternoon I was walking back home down the block, and as I got closer to the building, I saw two young boys about 10 years old outside the entrance, and they were laughingly yanking a couple of pit bulls on choker chains, letting the dogs' snarling snouts get within inches of tearing each other apart. And the dogs were like, rah, 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 rah. And the kids were just yanking the dogs back and laughing their heads off, because what could be more fun? And as I got closer, the boys looked up in my direction, and one of them said to the other, "Be cool, he's a cop." And they pulled the dogs apart. Now it all made sense. The sudden deference of everyone in the building, the confused, hesitant looks on the dealer and the other men's faces that night when I came on with my TV cop show voice and my sleep-deprived fearlessness. I had heard about city landlords renting cheap apartments to cops to scare dealers out of buildings. This was a known thing. They had put all this together and come to the obvious conclusion. Because who else would have talked to them like that? He would have to be crazy. Now, remember, this was 13 years ago. No beard, no gray hair. So let's just pause and... Anyway, now I was at a crossroads, right? Because I could easily, in any number of ways, let people in the building know that I was not, in fact, a cop. And that, indeed, for me, as perhaps some of them, cops made me nervous. Or I could let them continue to think I was one, which would be a dangerous game, especially if I was found out. But the idea of the all-night noise coming back convinced me to give it a shot. So over the next few weeks, I played up the cop routine. I found a New York Rangers hockey team warm-up jacket at a consignment shop, and a pair of wraparound Oakley shades, the virtual uniform of the New York City undercover cop. I even took to going on occasional patrols around the block, giving lingering stares to potential customers hanging in doorways, as in, move on. The charade began to wear on me, though. I started drinking more and having crazy, violent dreams, like Bollywood musicals mixed with The Bad Lieutenant, which I wrote off to the stress of being a cop. One morning, about 6 a.m., I was yanked out of a deep sleep by the sound of a crowing rooster. And I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, and all I could tell was that it was coming from the building in back of mine. In zero tolerance mode now, I threw on the Rangers jacket, put on the Oakleys, and I marched downstairs and around the corner and hit every buzzer on the front of the building at once until someone buzzed me in. And then I bounded from floor to floor until I found where it sounded like the crowing was coming from, and I pounded on an apartment door. And I said, "I'm looking for the rooster." And no answer. But I can hear on the other side of the door a sort of ragtag sing-along going on inside. So I pounded on the door again. Nothing. And I tried the door, and it was unlocked. So I opened it, and I stepped into a cramped apartment, bags of clothes piled up, and food set aside. And I stepped around a dividing wall into a room full of men and women, small, mestizo looking. And they were sitting in a circle of folding chairs. As I came into the room, they turned to me, wide-eyed. And I said, "I'm here about the rooster." And they looked at me with obvious fear. And I could see now that several of them were holding Bibles, and that I'd interrupted some kind of prayer meeting. I caught my own reflection in the mirror over the dining room table. And even shielded by the Oakleys, I looked deranged. One of the women began to sob, and the man next to her took her hand in his, and he whispered to her in Spanish. And I realized I must have looked like someone from immigration, or something worse. Well, at that moment, the weight of the whole ruse crashed down on me. The air of violence, the ugly display of authority, the ridiculous outfit. I said, "I'm sorry," and backed my way to the door. "Really sorry," I said, and then slipped into the hall. And out in the hall, I could feel my heart beating rapidly. And by the time I made it down to the street, it was pounding, and I had broken into a cold sweat. And circling, rounding the block, and then ducking back into my building, I came face to face with the dealer and his girlfriend. And it seemed as if a tiny smirk played on his lips as they took in my panicked demeanor and then exchanged looks and moved past me out the door. Up in my apartment, I began to wonder if the smirk meant something. Maybe they suspect what's going on. Maybe they've known all along and were waiting to see how far I would play it out. The images from the prayer meeting kept coming back too, the terrified looks on the faces of the men and women, and my own manic reflection in the mirror over the dining table. It was clear at that point I had had enough. That night, I put away the cop outfit for good. And when Hector, the super, told me a few days later that the landlord was suddenly offering tenants modest buyouts, a few $1,000s to give up their leases, I decided to take it. Now, a funny thing happened over the next few weeks as I got ready for my move. The dealer and his girlfriend disappeared. No one knew what had happened to them. Meanwhile, the entire building, in fact, the whole block, took on a relaxed, almost cheerful vibe. It was as if someone, some unsung hero, or some unwitting tool, had helped reclaim them. The day I moved out, a new tenant was lovingly placing a potted plant in the freshly painted foyer. And down the street, in what had been an empty storefront, a cafe was unrolling a grand opening banner. In the months after that, I began to realize that while I thought I had been working the system had been working me. Instead of outracing the tide of gentrification, I was a pilot fish, helping it along. And now I was out too. That was my last real lease on a New York apartment. The few thousand I got from the landlord didn't last long, and I bounced around apartment shares and sublets for a year or so before leaving New York for good. I've been back to visit, gone by the old building, the block, my beat. It's changed a lot, but it's still got an edge. Walking by, even years later, I get a brief surge of adrenaline, a muscle memory of fear or power. It's hard to tell which.